Thanks very much. Thanks very much for staying, everybody. I know it's quite late in the day now. Okay, so as we've just heard in the two fantastic presentations we've just been listening to, there are a vast number of different pre-cooling techniques which are currently available. And really this reflects the difficulty of trying to have a technique that provides a large cooling impulse while still remaining practical for use in the field at a number of different venues throughout the calendar year. When we consider internal cooling through ice slurry ingestion, this is becoming widely evidenced as an ergogen for endurance performance in the heat, with experimental trials demonstrating improved time trial performance compared with no cooling, and similar time to exhaustion performance as whole body water immersion, which is the gold standard measure. However, recent meta-analyses and systematic reviews, some don't actually include whole body water immersion because of the practicalities of utilizing this in the field. And these papers have gone on to recommend ice slurry ingestion as the best alternative to whole body water immersion. However, when we consider the external approach, the combined use of cooling garments, or the mixed methods approach, is now gaining prominence, having been shown to improve intermittent sprint performance in the heat and improve team sport, or the work done in team sport training sessions. However, there's been no direct comparison of these practical and prominent internal and external techniques on endurance performance in the heat. And furthermore, it's unclear precisely through which mechanisms these techniques operate and whether it's a shared mechanism or whether cooling from the inside out or the outside in benefits performance in different ways. As a result, the aims were to compare internal and external cooling techniques on the determinants of endurance performance in the heat, and secondly, to investigate the mechanisms underpinning these techniques in order that we may be able, as it may inform where they're actually best utilized. The determinants of endurance performance was adopted as an exercise model because it not only provides a valid assessment of endurance performance, which is well understood and recognized by coaches and athletes, but it also allows us to investigate the components that actually account for a large variation in endurance performance. So we can try to separate through which pathway these interventions are actually impacting on the final performance. As a result of the large body of evidence supporting it and the magnitude of, or the reduction in core temperature that is associated with, it's hypothesized that internal cooling would provide the greatest benefit to endurance performance. So we recruited 12 local runners, and they visited the lab on 4 occasions. After a familiarization, they then completed 3 trials in a randomized order, all of which were matched for fluid consumption and were preceded by 20 minutes of either ice slurry ingestion, external cooling, which included, so this was a mixed methods approach, which included wearing an ice vest, cooling shorts, hand and forearm immersion in 9 degrees water, and frozen towels across the head and neck. And you can see smiling and enjoying it there. And the final condition was a control no cooling condition where they sat for 20 minutes. So just to provide an overview of the trials, and below we've got ticks which are representing when measures were taken. Participants entered the hot and humid environment immediately and stayed in that environment for the whole time. So the rest and cooling periods were completed in the heat. Then just want to draw your attention to following the cessation of cooling, we had a 15-minute period before, which included the warm-up, before the exercise test began. This was to try to replicate a competition schedule where people, wouldn't just be cooled and then go straight into an exercise test. Into a performance. So the participants then completed a speed-based incremental test before having a very short break and then going going into a gradient-based run to exhaustion. This allowed us to calculate the following. We analyzed running speeds at the fixed blood lactate concentrations of 2 and 3.5 millimole, and these were used to denote the lactate threshold and the lactate turn point respectively. Running economy was assessed across the first 6 stages of the speed-based incremental test, and VO2 max was assessed at the end of the gradient-based run to exhaustion. We also measured a selection of derivative calculations and secondary measures. So what did we find? So this is the mean blood lactate response to the control condition, with the red lines representing where we took our measures of blood lactate, where we did the analysis on. And we can see a clear trend for a reduction in blood lactate levels following the cooling interventions. We observed a main effect, and the only significant difference was following the internal condition. However, you can see a clear trend for both conditions, and the effect sizes were exactly the same for both treatments. What do these, in practical terms, what do these mean? Well, this equated to a 0.3 kilometre of an hour improvement at the lactate threshold, and a 0.2 kilometre an hour improvement at the lactate turn point. Just to put that into context, for somebody who's definitely a sub-elite runner like myself, completing a 5K, assuming that I'm running at my lactate turn point pace, I would normally complete it in about 25 minutes, and this would actually save me 25 seconds. For somebody who's a bit closer, quite a lot closer to the elite end of the spectrum, and they're running 5K in 15 minutes, it would save them about 9 or 10 seconds. So whilst it's a small effect on the graph, I would argue that it's meaningful. And just finally, with the determinants, no differences were observed in VO2 max, running economy, the time to exhaustion during the gradient part of the test, and velocity at VO2 max. However, when we consider the thermoregulatory responses, some clear differences between the two cooling techniques were observed. Firstly, with core temperature, as expected, and as Jason mentioned earlier, we can see the marked reduction following the ice slurry condition, the marked reduction in core temperature. However, an interesting interaction then occurred during the exercise period with the fastest rate of rise in core temperature following or in the internal condition, and the slowest rate of rise in the external condition. So much so that when we look at the delta change, again, the greatest change was in the internal condition, and the smallest was in the external condition. When we look at skin temperature, as expected, because it's an external technique, there was a clear reduction in skin temperature following the external, and this continued for just over half of the exercise protocol, whereas internal remained unchanged. And when we combine these into the derivative calculation of mean body temperature, we can see that effect on skin temperature, reducing the mean body temperature during the cooling period, and in combination with that reduced rate of increase in core temperature, we can then see that there's a consistently lower body temperature in the external group. Whereas whilst internal provides a benefit, provides a difference at the start of exercise, this appeared to reduce actually at the end of the first exercise stage. Just when we consider now the physiological and perceptual variables, again, we can see a clear reduction following both pre-cooling techniques in the physiological strain. And for thermal sensation, it reduced both cooling techniques reduced thermal sensation with the magnitude of or the effect size greatest following the external condition. And no differences were observed for heart rate and RPE. So in conclusion, contrary to what was hypothesized, there was no difference between internal and external cooling across the determinants of endurance performance. However, from a thermoregulatory perspective, there was an interesting interaction with the greatest rate of rise following the internal condition and the slowest following the external condition. From an application perspective, this could indicate that internal cooling may be better suited to shorter events, whereas external cooling may be better suited to longer events because of that reduced rate of heat storage. And just finally, from a mechanistic perspective, the reduction in blood lactate levels that we observed reflects a reduced metabolic strain, and the benefits that we normally associate with pre-cooling may arise through not only this reduced metabolic strain, but in combination with the reduced physiological strain and thermal sensation. Thank you very much for listening. I'll try and answer any questions.
Thank you. Very well there. Are there any questions? Ooh. Ooh.
You go.
Well, thank you for the presentation. Now you show a difference at 2 millimolars and 3.5 millimolars, and then you see there's a difference here, but you don't see any difference in performance. I mean, you see the same performance in your VO2 max test. So I would also ask, should I be concerned about my lactate threshold at 2 or 3 millimolars? Well, I mean, when I do a time trial, I have a steady state lactate of 10 millimolars. So why do I have to be concerned? Also, we know that lactate is just a release. It's just a measure of the balance between the glycolysis and what is removed into
Well, I think
the electrical
I'd argue
chain.
that.
So is it important?
Well, I think I'd argue that it's certainly indicative of something. We know that these techniques work, and the determinants of endurance performance are an established model that coaches and athletes widely use to not only quantify the training status of their athletes, but to inform future training direction. And I think the differences that we saw, whilst they are small, I think if a coach saw that, that's sort of a traditional training effect, a rightward and downward shift of the.
I mean, we're not coaches, so we should be beyond that. I mean, we should use our physiological knowledge to say, is it important that your lactate is 0.3 lower at very low speeds? I mean, when you don't see a difference in performance. I mean, this has no impact.
Work because
Sure.
when we look at the pre-cooling studies as a whole, so when we try to pin down the mechanisms.
I agree that pre-cooling works. It's just it didn't have any performance effect in your trial. So what does it mean that lactate was lower at the lower running speed? Does it have any performance impact? That was my question and comment. So
I'll certainly taken on board. Certainly taken on board.
We'll come back to the round robin discussion.
Thanks, Jim. Same on lactate, but different perspective here. Did you arterialize your blood samples? That means, did you warm your hand before that blood sampling? Because of that pre-cooling, you probably caused some vasoconstriction. So whatever concentration you get in your blood might not be the real.
No, we didn't. But there was a 15-minute period from when the cooling period ended, of which 5 minutes was an active warm-up, a running warm-up on the treadmill. So the first blood sample wasn't taken until 18 minutes after the end of cooling, and people have been in a hot environment all the time.
Did you notice that they were quite cold, even at the point where you took the blood sample? Because in my experience, when you took blood samples following pre-cooling, there will be vasoconstrictions, and unless you arterialize your hands before that blood sample, that samples might not be reflective.
Okay.
Yeah. So that could be the reason why you saw a lowering of lactate, possibly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then one last quick question.
It's just a comment, really. I wanted to make this also for Jason's talk, but there was no time. Regarding the mechanism that you mentioned, and also Jason, one important thing that you should remember is that the gastrointestinal tract is full of TRP ion channels, which means that there's a lot of thermosensors in there. So probably an effect on the perceptual aspect is the fact that we're actually activating the thermosensors in the gut. And this obviously creates a behavioral response as well. Of course, it's combined with the thermal responses from the skin, but this is it's an important area for thermal sensation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Lots
you.
of food for thought.